Débat, the honourable member for St. John South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last speaker, the Conservative speaker, he began his speech with talk of kings and queens and crowns. My speech will focus on mere mortals, ordinary Newfoundlanders and Labradorians and Canadians, the people that the Conservatives have forgotten. I had a public meeting in my riding of St. John South Mount Pearl just this past Sunday, Mr. Speaker. To start the meeting, a woman, she's 65 years old, she approached me. She pulled me aside and she wanted to speak to me privately about her problem. The woman, she's single, she rents an apartment, and the company that owns the apartment just raised her rent by $45 every 2 weeks. That's $90 a month. That's $1,080 a year. Mr. Speaker, here's the problem. She's retired, she's on a fixed income, she's on a small pension, and she has no idea how to pay for the increase in her rent. No idea. Question. What's in this bill, this Economic Action Plan 2013 Act, this Economic Inaction Plan 2013 Act, what's in this bill for that senior in my riding? Nothing. Nothing. No help whatsoever. The lady asked me not to forget her, to do something about housing, to do something for people like seniors, for people on fixed incomes, for low-income earners who are having a harder and harder time getting by, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'm doing that right now, and I'll do it at every opportunity, every chance I get to speak about the Conservative Economic Inaction Plan 2013. Mr. Speaker, what's in this budget for low-income earners to help keep a roof over their heads? Again, nothing. In fact, the Conservatives voted down a recent New Democratic bill for a national housing strategy, the plan to fix Canada's housing crisis. What does this government do, Mr. Speaker? What does their budget do? The Conservatives go a step further than just voting down the NDP plan for a housing strategy. Starting next year, they'll cut homelessness funding by $15 million a year. $15 million a year. This budget does nothing for that senior in my riding, and seniors, Mr. Speaker, they are suffering. There's a story in the news back home in the last few days about an 82-year-old man from the Corner Brook area of western Newfoundland, and he was charged with theft, Mr. Speaker. He was charged with theft for stealing food from a grocery store. 82 years old. The police say that this type of incident is rare, but a seniors advocate says this is only the beginning. And I quote from the news story from that advocate I just mentioned, quote, "More seniors will start to resort to petty crime as they cannot afford to eat by the Canadian Food Guide. Eat by Canada's Food Guide. They can't afford to pay rent, Mr. Speaker. That's why. They can't afford to turn on the heat in their own homes. That's what this country has come to. That's what they've done to our country." What does this budget do for Newfoundland and Labrador? Of all the things in this budget, Mr. Speaker, what resonates most back home? What have people been talking about? They're talking about how the price of hospital parking is going to increase, about how the poor and the sick, the most vulnerable in our society, will have to feed even more money that they don't have, into parking meters. Mr. Speaker, they can cut taxes to big business. They can cut taxes to industry, give industry breaks, but who pays? The sick and the poor. That's who pays, Mr. Speaker. That's who pays under this Conservative government. What's in this budget for Labrador specifically, Mr. Speaker? Status quo, more of the same, dirt roads, poor internet service. But who knows what goes on behind the scenes, Mr. Speaker? We know that when Peter Panashway was our representative in the federal cabinet, he pitted the big land against the island. Panashway actually boasted about his divisive politics, the worst kind of politics. Panashway held up infrastructure projects on the island. He held them up. He actually admitted to that in an attempt to move forward projects in Labrador. This is the type of politicking that goes on behind the scenes with the Conservatives. But they're also in our faces with it, Mr. Speaker. This is the third omnibus bill. It includes 49 pieces of legislation, from increased user fees, hospital parking, to cuts to health care, to damaging cuts to credit unions. Most Canadians won't realize the ramifications of this budget because it's so big. 49 pieces of legislation. And because there's so little time to debate it. It denies MPs the ability to thoroughly study the bill and its implications. New Democrats would like to send so much of this omnibus bill to various House of Commons committees so we can bring in experts, so we can analyze the true implications. But Conservatives deny us that opportunity. They deny us that right because they don't want the scrutiny. They don't want you to know. They don't want you to know what's happening to your Canada. The Conservatives are trying to tell Canadians that there's nothing to see in this bill. There's nothing to see here, Mr. Speaker. Now, in a way, that's true. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing for job creation. There's nothing to make life more affordable. There's nothing to strengthen the services that families rely on. There's little in this budget for youth, Mr. Speaker. In fact, youth unemployment stands at more than 14%. 14%, Mr. Speaker. And while the Conservatives just announced another 5,000 paid internships in this budget, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the need. You don't hear the Conservatives speak about the $14,000 a year those internships will actually pay. $14,000 a year. $14,000 isn't enough to pay your student loans or participate in the economy, Mr. Speaker. It's not enough to live on. There's not a word, there's not a breath, Mr. Speaker, in this budget about student debt. The average student debt in this country stands at $28,000 per student. How can students participate in the economy that the Conservatives like to trumpet as their success, when they begin their working lives with no work and a $28,000 anchor around their necks? Let's move on to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Mr. Speaker, I worked for almost 20 years as a journalist, 12 years as a daily newspaper reporter, 5 years as an editor-in-chief, as a columnist, another 2 years as an open-line radio host. Most of those years were with private media outlets. I know personally, I know the kind of pressures that can be exerted on a paper or a news outlet to run or not to run a story. Incredible pressures, Mr. Speaker, by advertisers, by government, and by industry. That's why the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is so important. I see the CBC as the jewel in Canada's democratic crown. The Conservative government is taking a harder line on collective bargaining, giving itself sweeping new powers to steer independent Crown corporations on their negotiations with employees over wages and over benefits. The main targets are the CBC, Canada Post, and Via Rail. This bill gives the government the power to have a Treasury Board official sit in on collective bargaining negotiations at Crown corporations. Now, the union representing employees at the CBC warns that the new powers are a, quote, ridiculous infringement on the independence of the CBC, Mr. Speaker. And I agree with that statement. Here's a quote from Marc-Philippe Lauren. Now, he's the CBC branch president of the Canadian Media Guild, and that's a union that represents most employees. Quote, I don't know how anybody looking at that cannot see this as turning the public broadcaster into a state broadcaster. A state broadcaster. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker? Can you imagine the CBC being turned into a state broadcaster, a mouthpiece for the Conservative Party? Can you imagine a Crown corporation changing the terms and conditions of employment for a non-union worker at any time? Can you imagine a day A day in Canada, Mr. Speaker, when workers and pensions are under constant attack. Can you imagine a day in Canada, Mr. Speaker, when post-secondary graduates are crippled by debt and government doesn't care? Can you imagine a day in Canada, Mr. Speaker, when a government would ignore a housing crisis? Can you imagine a day when an 82-year-old man is forced to steal food for his supper? Because that day in Canada has arrived under this Conservative government with this new Conservative inaction plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.